Most suffering does not come from life itself, but from how relentlessly we think about it. The mind circles, analyzes, judges, and rehearses until experience becomes distant and unreal. Carl Jung observed that when consciousness loses contact with instinct, feeling, and the body, a person becomes trapped inside their own head. Life turns into an idea instead of a lived reality. But the moment attention shifts outward, toward action, sensation, and genuine encounter, something profound changes. Anxiety loosens, meaning returns. You stop watching life from behind your thoughts and begin participating in it again. And that is where real transformation begins. When a person lives primarily in their head, life gradually loses its immediacy. Experience becomes filtered, delayed, and softened by endless interpretation. One no longer meets events directly, but through thought about them. Feelings are analyzed before they are felt. Decisions are rehearsed before they are lived. The world becomes something observed rather than encountered. I have seen how this condition creates a peculiar form of alienation. One is present, yet not truly participating. Thinking is a noble function, but it was never meant to dominate the whole personality. When it does, it separates consciousness from instinct, sensation, and the natural rhythms of life. The individual begins to trust ideas more than experience, explanations more than perception. The body is ignored, motion is questioned, intuition is dismissed as unreliable. In this state, life feels strangely distant, as if one were watching oneself live from behind a pane of glass. This disconnection produces much of what people call anxiety, not because life is inherently overwhelming, but because it is no longer being lived directly. The psyche thrives on movement and contact. When experience is replaced by constant reflection, energy turns inward and begins to circle itself. Thoughts multiply, doubts grow louder, the mind becomes crowded, while life itself grows faint. One tries to solve existence instead of entering it. At a deeper level, living in the head is often a strategy of protection. To think about life rather than feel it seems safer. Thought creates distance from pain, uncertainty, and vulnerability. Yet what it protects against, it also deprives. Joy, meaning, and vitality require presence. They cannot be accessed through analysis alone. A person who remains in thought may avoid discomfort, but they also avoid aliveness. I have often noticed that when such a person begins to act, even in small ways, something changes almost immediately. Not because all problems vanish, but because consciousness reconnects with reality. Sensation returns. The body speaks. Feeling re-enters awareness. Life regains texture and weight. Thinking becomes clearer, calmer, more grounded, because it is no longer trying to replace living. The task is not to abandon thought, but to restore its proper place. Thinking must follow experience, not stand in its way. The psyche is allowed to engage with life directly. Balance returns naturally. One feels less trapped, not because life has changed, but because one is no longer hiding from it behind thought. And perhaps this is the essential truth. When you step out of your head and back into life, the world does not become simpler, but it becomes real again. When a person remains trapped in thought, it is often because the ego has mistaken thinking for control. The ego believes that if it can understand everything in advance, nothing unexpected will occur. It treats analysis as a form of protection. Every possibility is examined, every risk imagined, every outcome rehearsed. On the surface, this appears intelligent and cautious. Psychologically, it is something else entirely. It is fear wearing the mask of reason. I have observed that the ego is deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. It wants firm ground, clear explanations, and guarantees. When life refuses to offer these, the ego compensates by thinking more. It believes that if it stays alert enough, nothing will overwhelm it. Yet the opposite happens. The more the ego tries to control life through thought, the more tense and fragmented the psyche becomes. Thinking multiplies because it is no longer serving understanding, but defending against vulnerability. This defensive thinking creates paralysis. Decisions feel dangerous because they involve exposure to the unknown. Action is delayed until absolute clarity is achieved, a clarity that never arrives. The ego waits for permission that life does not give. Meanwhile, energy stagnates. Anxiety increases, not because the situation is worsening, but because the psyche is trapped in anticipation without movement. Control through thought is seductive because it creates the illusion of mastery. One feels busy, vigilant, prepared, yet life cannot be lived in advance. No amount of thinking can eliminate uncertainty. The unconscious does not reveal itself through logic alone. It demands experience, risk, and engagement. When the ego refuses this encounter, it remains isolated, cut off from the very forces that could guide it. Letting go of excessive control does not mean becoming reckless or unconscious. It means accepting that not everything must be understood before it is lived. The ego must learn to trust the psyche as a whole, not just the thinking function, but feeling, instinct, and intuition as well. When this trust develops, the need for constant analysis diminishes. Thought becomes calmer, more precise, because it no longer carries the burden of total control. I have often seen that when a person allows themselves to act despite uncertainty, relief follows almost immediately. The mind quiets, not because answers have appeared, but because the ego is no longer pretending it can manage life alone. Experience takes over where thinking reaches its limit, and perhaps this is the quiet shift that changes everything. When you stop using thought to control life and begin using it to understand the life you are already living. When thinking dominates consciousness, instinct and feeling are often treated as unreliable, even dangerous. The individual learns to trust only what can be explained, justified, or controlled. Yet this creates a severe imbalance. The psyche is not governed by thought alone, it speaks through sensation, emotion, and intuitive knowing long before words appear. When these voices are ignored, the mind loses its most accurate guides. I have seen how people mistrust their feelings because they seem vague or contradictory. They prefer ideas that feel solid and clear. But feeling is not meant to provide certainty. It provides value, tells us what matters, what drains us, what gives life weight. Without this guidance, decisions become abstract. One may know many reasons for action, yet feel no inner alignment. Life moves forward, but without conviction. Instinct, too, is often misunderstood. It is not impulse or recklessness. It is the psyche's inherited wisdom, a deep responsiveness to situations before conscious thought catches up. When instinct is denied, the body becomes tense, signals are ignored, and exhaustion follows. Many people live as if they were minds floating above bodies, surprised when anxiety, fatigue, or restlessness appear. These are messages from parts of the psyche that have been excluded from the conversation. Intuition offers yet another form of guidance. It points toward possibilities not yet fully formed. It does not argue, it hints. When intuition is dismissed, life becomes confined to what is already known. The future feels narrow. Overthinking increases because thought is trying to compensate for guidance it has silenced. The mind works harder, yet direction becomes weaker. Reintegrating these functions does not mean abandoning reason, it means restoring dialogue. Thought must listen as much as it speaks. When feeling is allowed to inform decisions, hesitation decreases. When instinct is trusted, action becomes more natural. When intuition is respected, life regains movement and meaning. This integration is often uncomfortable at first. One must tolerate ambiguity, emotional exposure, and the risk of being wrong. Yet this discomfort is not a sign of danger, it is a sign of life returning to consciousness. The psyche begins to move again as a whole rather than as a single overworked function. And perhaps this is the quiet truth worth holding. When you stop treating instinct and feeling as enemies, they become allies, and the mind no longer has to carry the weight of your life alone. Anxiety often feels like a problem of thought, but in truth, it is a problem of distance. When a person remains locked inside rumination, life is kept at arm's length. The mind circles endlessly around imagined futures, remembered mistakes, and hypothetical dangers, while the present moment remains untouched. I have seen how this condition intensifies suffering. The psyche is built for engagement. When it is denied contact with experience, tension accumulates. Rumination creates a false sense of activity. One feels busy, alert, and concerned, yet nothing truly changes. Anxiety thrives in this suspended state. It feeds on anticipation without resolution. The individual believes they must think their way to safety, yet safety never arrives because the psyche is waiting for movement, not explanation. Thought alone cannot discharge emotional energy. Only experience can do that. When a person begins to act, even modestly, something essential shifts. Action introduces reality into the system, brings feedback, resistance, and confirmation. The mind no longer needs to imagine endlessly, because life responds. Anxiety loosens its grip, not because the situation becomes perfect, but because the psyche is no longer trapped in rehearsal. Experience grounds consciousness. It reminds the individual that they are capable of meeting what arises. This does not mean reckless action or forced optimism. It means participation. Walking, speaking, creating, touching, deciding. These are ways consciousness reconnects with life. Sensation returns. Time slows. The body anchors the mind. What was once overwhelming becomes manageable because it is no longer multiplied by imagination. One problem at a time replaces 1,000 imagined ones. I have often noticed that anxiety diminishes most when a person allows themselves to be imperfectly involved. They stop waiting for the ideal moment or complete understanding. They accept that clarity emerges through doing, not before it. The psyche relaxes because it is no longer being asked to predict everything. It is allowed to respond instead. This return to experience also restores trust in one's capacity to adapt. Each lived moment teaches the psyche that uncertainty can be survived. Confidence grows quietly from this knowledge. Thought becomes more measured, less frantic, because it is informed by reality rather than speculation. And perhaps this is the quiet liberation anxiety resists. When you stop living in anticipation and step into experience, the mind no longer needs to shout to be heard. It can finally rest. Many people search for meaning by thinking harder about life, as if the right idea will suddenly unlock purpose. Yet meaning does not appear through analysis alone. It emerges through involvement. I have often observed that those who remain trapped in their heads feel life is empty or confusing, not because meaning is absent, but because they are standing outside of it. Meaning is not an object to be found. It is a relationship that forms through participation. When a person overanalyzes their existence, they turn life into a concept rather than an experience. They ask endlessly, "What does this mean?" While avoiding the very actions that could reveal the answer, the psyche does not respond to interrogation. It responds to engagement. Meaning grows when a person commits themselves to something, a task, a relationship, a responsibility, and allows themselves to be changed by it. Without this commitment, understanding remains abstract and unsatisfying. I have seen many individuals who possessed great intelligence, yet felt profoundly lost. They could explain everything, yet felt nothing. Their thinking was sharp, but their lives lacked weight. This happens when thought replaces lived contact, meaning requires friction. It arises where effort meets resistance, where intention meets reality. Without this meeting, ideas remain hollow, no matter how refined they appear. Participation also demands risk. One must accept that not every action will succeed, that mistakes will occur, that discomfort is unavoidable. The ego resists this because it prefers clarity without consequence. But a life without consequence is also a life without depth. Meaning cannot develop in a protected mental space. It requires exposure to the world, to others, and to one's own limitations. When a person steps out of their head and into experience, even briefly, something subtle but powerful occurs. Moments begin to matter. Time feels textured rather than rushed. One feels involved rather than detached. Meaning does not arrive as a grand explanation, but as a quiet sense that life is worth engaging. This feeling cannot be forced. It must be lived into. Overthinking delays this process by keeping the individual in observation mode. They watch life instead of entering it. But life does not reveal its significance to spectators. It speaks to participants. When a person allows themselves to take part, meaning begins to form naturally, without being chased. And perhaps this is the simple truth so often overlooked. Meaning is not discovered by thinking about life, but by stepping into it and allowing it to shape you. When a person finally steps out of constant mental preoccupation, something deeper than relief occurs. The psyche begins to reorganize itself around a center that is no longer ruled by anxious thought. I call this process individuation, It is not a sudden transformation, but a gradual realignment of the personality toward wholeness. One no longer lives solely from the ego's fears and strategies, but from a deeper sense of inner direction. Living in the head fragments the psyche. The thought isolates itself and attempts to manage the whole personality. When this grip loosens, other parts are allowed to return. Feeling regains its authority. Instinct resumes its guidance. Intuition points toward possibilities that cannot yet be fully explained. This reintegration creates a quiet sense of rightness. Decisions feel less forced. Action arises more naturally. One feels guided rather than driven. Individuation does not remove conflict from life. Instead, it changes one's relationship to it. Problems are no longer experienced as threats to identity, but as challenges to be engaged. The individual feels less compelled to overthink because life itself provides feedback. The psyche learns through lived experience rather than speculation. Thought becomes reflective instead of defensive. It helps make sense of what has been lived, rather than attempting to control what has not yet occurred. This shift often brings a subtle feeling of freedom, not the freedom of unlimited choice, but the freedom of inner alignment. One is no longer pulled in opposing directions by fear and desire. There is a growing sense of coherence. The personality moves as a whole. Even uncertainty becomes more tolerable because it is no longer faced alone by the thinking mind, but by the entire psyche. Many people expect individuation to feel dramatic or euphoric. In truth, it often feels simple. One becomes more present, less rushed, less divided. Life feels closer. The world regains weight and texture. One participates rather than observes. This participation does not eliminate suffering, but it gives suffering context and meaning. The process continues throughout life. Each new stage demands renewed engagement and honesty. Individuation is not an endpoint, but a way of living consciously. When thought is integrated rather than dominant, the psyche remains flexible and alive. Perhaps this is the quiet transformation that changes everything. When you stop living inside your head and begin living from your center, life no longer feels like something happening to you. It becomes something you are actively part of,